Everybody in this valley knew the size of Ada Rourke's house because everybody had measured it with their mouths. 14 feet by 16, one room, one window, a stovepipe that leaned like a drunk. Folks said it wasn't a house at all, just a box a man had nailed together in a hurry before the winter caught him, and then the man died and left the box behind, and the woman stayed in it out of stubbornness or grief or because she had nowhere else to be. I know what they said, because I said some of it myself. I carried a paper in my coat that January that would have taken that box off her. Signed, witnessed, legal as Sunday. I'd worked out the words I'd use. I'd practiced them on my horse, which is the only creature that will listen to a man rehearse cruelty without telling him to stop. I never said them. What happened instead, in the 4 days the storm had us, is the thing I've spent the rest of my life failing to explain to people who weren't there. So let me try it the slow way. Let me start where the wind starts. Stay with me. I'll tell it straight, and I'll tell you where I lied to myself, and I'll tell you what a trapper named Cull Bram saw in a 14 by 16 room that I'd been looking at for 6 years and never once seen. The horse quit before I did. That's the honest beginning. Not some noble moment on a ridge with the wind singing prophecy at me, just Solomon planting his forefeet in a drift and going stone-dumb, ears flat, refusing the trail the way a man refuses a lie he's already told twice. I kicked him. I'm not proud of it. He didn't so much as swing his head. Snow had been coming since noon, small and dry and businesslike, the kind that doesn't announce itself. By 4 o'clock the sky had dropped down onto the timber like a wet blanket over a birdcage, and I couldn't see the switchbacks below me, couldn't see the workplace, couldn't see my own hands well enough to count them. Inside my coat, against my ribs, was the paper. I want to be clear about the paper, because I've heard how the story gets told down at Prine's store, and in that telling I'm a kindly old rancher who rode out through a blizzard to check on a widow. That's a beautiful piece of fiction. Somebody ought to write it down. The truth is I had gone to the bank in October and bought Ada Rourke's note off Fen Doyle for $81 and change, because her 40 acres had the only reliable spring on the north side of the creek, and because I had 400 head that summered dry, and because a man tells himself that a business necessity is a kind of weather, something that happens, that nobody is guilty of. I had it worked out. I was going to say, Ada, I'll give you till the thaw. I was going to say it kindly. I had said it kindly to Solomon 11 or 12 times on the ride up, and Solomon had not once told me I was a coward. Here's the other thing you should know about me, and then I'll get on with it. I keep a book. Little brown thing, oilcloth cover, fits in a breast pocket. 2 columns on every page. Owed, paid. My father died owing $400 to a man in St. Joseph he'd never met, and I watched what that did to my mother's face over the 11 years it took her to clear it, so I have kept accounts every day since I was 19 years old. Every debt in, every debt out. Money mostly, but not only money. I've got a line in there from 1877 that says Holly's Meeks pulled my wagon out of the Salado, unpaid, and Holly's Meeks has been dead 9 years, and I still don't know how to strike it. It's a sickness. My wife said so. She said it kindly, too, at the end, when she was down to about 90 pounds and had earned the right to say anything she wanted. So there I was, 61 years old, half frozen, on a horse that had more sense than me, carrying a legal instrument and thinking about columns. That's when I heard the shot. It came from below and to the left, muffled. The way sound comes through heavy snow, flattened, like somebody had dropped a stove lid in a room down a long hall. Then, maybe 40 seconds later, another one. 2 shots spaced. That's not hunting. That's a man saying here to whoever's left to hear it. Solomon came unstuck. Funny how that works. He'd stand in a drift till judgment for me, but let some stranger fire a rifle into the weather, and suddenly he's got opinions about which way is down. We went off the trail and through the aspens, and I got a branch across the face that opened my cheek, and I remember being obscurely pleased about it, the way you get pleased at any evidence that you're still a thing that bleeds. Then the ground fell away, and I was on the wagon road above the workplace, and I saw the shape. At first I took it for a bear standing up. It was that big and that wrong. It was moving downhill with a rolling, sideways gait, and it had something on its back and something in its arms, and the snow was going across it in sheets, so it kept disappearing and coming back. I hollered, it kept walking. I got in front of it and it stopped, and it took me a long second to build a man out of what I was looking at. Buffalo coat gone gray-white with ice. A beard with actual icicles in it. I'd heard men talk about that and always figured it for tall tale, but there they were, hanging off him like he'd been dredged up out of a river. A face burned by 40 winters into something you'd carve out of a burl, and strapped to his back with a length of harness leather, a boy of maybe 7, arms hanging. In his arms a woman. Where, he said. It wasn't a question. It didn't have room in it to be a question. He had spent whatever he had on getting down the mountain, and there wasn't any left over for punctuation. "Rourke Place," I said, "quarter-mile, follow the creek sound." He looked at me. I want to tell you he sized me up and found me wanting, and maybe that's true, but I think the plainer fact is he was looking at me the way you look at a fence post that talks. Some interest, no expectation. Then he started walking again. I turned Solomon and went with him, and I did what I could, which was nothing. I offered the horse. He didn't answer. I found out later he'd have had to set the woman down to lift her onto the saddle, and he'd made himself a rule about setting her down. The cabin came up out of the storm all at once, the way things do, and I'd forgotten how small it was. 14 by 16. I know because I paced it later out of some ugly need. One room. One window with 4 panes of real glass that Tom Rourke had freighted up from Pueblo in a crate of straw as a wedding gift, and that Ada washed on the first Sunday of every month, blizzard or no. A stovepipe leaning south. A woodshed the size of a coffin, half full. Yellow light in the window. That's the picture I've kept. The door opened before Cull Bram got to it, and Ada Rourke was standing there in a man's coat with her sleeves rolled. And she looked at what he was carrying, and she didn't say, "Oh Lord," and she didn't say what happened. She said, "Put her on the table, not the bed's cold." And she stepped back and swept the whole surface clear with her forearm. A bowl, a tin of coffee with a dent in it, a knife, a folded piece of sewing, swept it all onto the floor like it was nothing, like it wasn't every dish she owned. And there was one thin crash and the smell of coffee grounds going into the floorboard cracks, and Bram laid the woman down. He got the boy off his back. His hands wouldn't work the leather. He stood there for a second with his fingers hooked into claws, working at a knot he couldn't feel. Ada cut it. She had the knife off the floor and the leather cut, and the boy in her arms in about the time it takes to say so. Then she looked at me, standing in her doorway, snow to my knees, blood on my face. "Amos Kettle," she said. There was a whole essay in how she said my name. Shut the door. Let me tell you about the room, because the room is the story. 14 by 16. In it, a rope bed with a cornshuck tick. A table Tom Rourke had made out of a wagon gate. 2 chairs mismatched. A stove, a real one, cast iron, the single expensive object in her life, which she'd bought by selling Tom's saddle in the spring of '82, and which she blacked every week for reasons I have never understood and now do. A shelf with maybe 9 books, warped. A loom in the corner, taking up more room than a loom has any right to, with a half-finished coverlet on it in blue and dun. And against the far wall, under a piece of oilcloth, a cradle. I'd seen it before. Everybody in the valley had. Tom Rourke made it the winter before he died, made it out of black walnut he traded 3 weeks of labor for, and he carved a running vine up both rockers. And it was, I'm not a man with words for furniture, but I've been in the governor's house in Denver, and I never saw anything in it built with that much attention. The baby came early and wrong in March. Ada was 17 days recovering. Tom went out with a fever in his chest that April to cut poles and lay down in the wet grass and never got up again, and the cradle stayed under its oilcloth for 6 years while the valley talked. They said she was morbid. That's the word Fen Doyle's wife used, morbid. I nodded along. I want that on the record. I nodded along. The woman on the table was named Sarah Poe. We got that from the boy eventually when he came around enough to shake. His name was Micah. There was a father, Elias, and there'd been a wagon, and the wagon had gone off the shoulder on the third switchback with the horses still in the traces, and Elias Poe had put his family out onto the road and gone down after the animals and the flour and the stove, because they had $11 and a wagon, and if the wagon was gone, they had $11. He'd told them to walk, told them he'd be up directly. That was Micah wasn't sure, before dark. It was long past dark. Bram heard all of it standing by the door with his coat steaming. He hadn't come any farther into the room. Water was running off him onto Ada's floor, and he was looking at the puddle like it embarrassed him. "The 2 shots," I said, "that was you." "Signal," he said, "in case he come up." "Did he?" Bram didn't answer that. He'd taken his gloves off finally, and he was holding his right hand in his left. 2 fingers on the right one were gone at the second knuckle, old, healed, white. The 3 that were left had gone the color of wet ash. Ada looked over from the table. She didn't stop what she was doing, which was cutting Sarah Poe's frozen shoe off with the same knife she'd cut the leather with. "Sit down," she said to Bram. "I'll stand." "You'll sit down and put that hand in this bowl." "Ma'am." "I have exactly 1 bowl left," Ada said, "and you're going to use it before I decide to be sensible about it." He sat down. "I have thought about that hour more than I've thought about most of my life. Because this is where the story ought to turn into the one they tell at Prine's. The brave trapper, the steadfast widow, the rancher who came in from the cold. What actually happened is that the 4 of us, 5, counting the boy, who was conscious and silent, and would not let go of a wooden horse with 1 leg broken off, spent the hour doing small, stupid, physical things, badly, while a woman we didn't know slowly stopped dying on a table made out of a wagon gate. We rubbed snow on her feet because Bram said so, and Bram knew. Not fire, never fire. The fire will cook meat that can't feel itself cooking. Ada put water on. The stove ticked and roared. I brought in wood from the coffin-sized shed and did not say anything about how little was in it, and Ada watched me count it with my eyes and said nothing either, and that silence was the first real conversation she and I ever had. Micah threw up. Ada cleaned it with her own skirt and didn't look at him while she did it, which I understood later was mercy. A boy that age would rather be sick in front of a stranger who isn't watching. And around 10 o'clock Sarah Poe opened her eyes and said, "Elias is bringing the stove," and Ada said, "I know," and gave her water. She said, "I know." She didn't say he's gone. She didn't say we'll pray. She said, "I know," and held her head up, and let a dying woman believe her husband was coming up the road with a cook stove on his shoulder. I wrote nothing in my book that night. I want you to understand what that means. I've written in it the night my father died and the night my wife did. The wood went faster than it should have. Green pine burns like an argument, loud, hot, all smoke, no bottom to it. Ada had been feeding a stove for 6 years with what she could drag out of the deadfall behind the ridge, 1 load at a time on her back, because she had no horse. Tom's mule had gone to Fen Doyle in the 2nd year. Around 2 in the morning I went out for the last armload, and I stood in that shed with the wind screaming through the chinks, and I looked at what was left. 4 sticks, a rotten one, a bundle of kindling tied with string. I came back in and set it down by the stove, and I said, "That's it." Nobody said anything. The room was maybe 50 degrees and dropping. Sarah Poe had begun to shake in a way that was worse than the stillness before it. Bram had his coat over her. He was in shirt sleeves with his ruined hand wrapped in a rag, and he was looking at the loom. "That," he said. Ada didn't turn around. She said, "No. It's ash. Ash burns clean and slow, you could." I said no. And I thought, God forgive me, I thought, of course. Of course she'd hold on to it. 6 years in a box with a loom and a cradle and a set of dishes she'd just thrown on the floor, and here was the reason she was going to lose her place. Sentiment. Softness. A woman keeping furniture. I had the paper in my coat. I had it in my coat right then. Ada Rourke crossed the room. She took hold of the oilcloth on the far wall and pulled it off and let it drop. And there it was. Black walnut, dark as coffee. The running vine on the rockers. 6 years of no dust on it at all, because she had dusted it every week, the way she blacked the stove, the way she washed the 4 panes of glass. She said, "Amos, bring the axe." I didn't move. I want to say I refused out of some fine feeling. I think the truth is simpler and worse. I didn't move because I couldn't stand to be part of it. It was going to be an awful thing, and I didn't want it on my hands. I wanted to watch her do it and go home and tell it in a low voice at Prine's and have people say, "Lord." That's who I was at 2 in the morning on the 4th of January. Bram got up. He went out into the storm without a coat and came back with the axe, and he held it out to her, and she took it and looked at it, and her hands were fine. Not shaking. That's what undid me. Her hands were absolutely steady, and her face had gone somewhere else entirely, somewhere back 6 years, and she stood over that cradle for what felt like a long while, and the fire made the vine on the rockers move. Micah said, "Is that a bed for a baby?" Sarah Poe was shaking on the table with her teeth going. Ada said it was. Then she knelt down. She put the axe on the floor, and she ran her thumb along the carved vine, all the way up one rocker, slow, the way you'd trace a scar on somebody you loved, and she said something so quietly that I only caught the shape of it, and I have never told anybody what I think the shape of it was. She picked up the axe and she broke it. Not one clean stroke. That's the part nobody tells right. Black walnut doesn't give. It took her 11 blows, and the third one glanced and split the web of her hand, and Bram reached for the axe and she said, "Don't," in a voice like a door closing, and she finished it herself, bleeding on her knees in a 14 by 16 room at 2 in the morning, while a stranger's wife shook on her table. The cradle burned hot and long, and it smelled like church. Nobody spoke for an hour after that. Sarah Poe's shaking eased. Her color came back into something you could look at. Micah fell asleep sitting up against the wall with his broken wooden horse in his fist, and Ada put her own quilt over him and sat down on the floor next to the stove with her bleeding hand wrapped in a strip of her skirt, and stared at the fire, and did not cry, and did not speak, and did not stop looking at it. Cull Bram sat across from her, 20 stone of frozen trapper on a chair too small for him. And after a while, "This is the moment, if there is one," he said, very quietly, in a voice you'd use on a horse. "I had a girl." Ada looked up. Up on the Lost Fork, her and her mother both, 81. He was turning his ruined hand over, looking at where the fingers weren't. "Diphtheria come up the valley with a peddler. Took 9 days. I had $400 in plue and a good rifle, and I couldn't buy 9 days off it." The stove ticked. "I burned everything they touched," he said. "House, bedding, her doll. I burned it because the doctor said burn it, and I done it, and I thought, well, I thought I'd done the last hard thing there was." He nodded at the stove, at the fire in it. "That weren't the hard thing," he said. "This is the hard thing, burning what nobody told you to." Ada didn't answer, but she moved her hand, the hurt one, a few inches across the floor toward him, palm up, not touching, just there, and he looked at it a long moment. "He didn't take it." "I've thought about that too. I think he didn't take it because he'd have broken, and there wasn't room in that cabin for a man that size breaking." Toward dawn the wind changed. You get to know it living up here. It had been coming out of the northwest all night, hard and steady, howling in the stovepipe. Now it dropped and got confused and started shoving from the south, and that meant the pass was going to load up on the lee side and slide. Bram heard it before I did. He was on his feet with his coat already half on. "He's alive," he said. I said, "Cull, it's been 14 hours. He's alive. There's no man alive in that." Bram turned around and looked at me, and for the first time all night he really looked at me, and I understood that he'd known about the paper in my coat the entire time. I don't know how. Maybe Ada told him with her eyes. Maybe men like Bram can smell it. He said, "You got a spring on this place you want." Nobody had said one word about it all night. "There's a rock shelf under the third switchback," he said, turning back to the door. "Wind scours it. If he got under it, he's alive, and he's got maybe 2 hours before that slope comes down on him. He was working the latch with his bad hand and failing and doing it anyway. I ain't asking you." "You'll die," I said. "Likely." And then Ada Rourke stood up off the floor. She'd been on that floor for 4 hours. Her hand was black with dried blood through the cloth. She had ash in her hair. She was 5 foot 2 inches tall, and she weighed maybe 105 pounds, and she had just burned the only beautiful thing she owned. She went and got Tom's coat off the peg, the big one, the one that swallowed her, and she put it on and started rolling the sleeves. Sarah Poe said from the table, "No, no ma'am, no." And Ada said, without looking at anybody, in the most ordinary voice in the world, the voice you'd use to say the kettle's boiling, "2 men can dig faster than 1. She looked at me. "3 can dig faster than 2, she said. "But I've never known you to spend anything, Amos, that you didn't write down first." She went out the door. Bram went after her. And I stood in a 14 by 16 room with a sleeping boy and a dying woman, and a stove full of the ashes of a cradle. And I took out my book, and my hands were shaking so hard I couldn't have written in it if I'd wanted to. Ode paid. 6 years. She'd been across the creek from me 6 years. I had ridden past that window 300 times. I had eaten at Fen Doyle's table and heard the word morbid and put butter on my bread. The wind was tearing at the door she'd left open, and snow was coming across the floor in long white fingers, and out in the dark I could hear Bram shouting something and Ada answering him, and the sound of her voice in that weather was the smallest sound I have ever heard a human being make. I stood there. I want you to know exactly how long I stood there, because it's the only number in this whole story I've never written down. Then I went out and got Solomon out of the lee of the woodshed, and I put my shoulder into it, and I followed them up. We found the wagon at first light. What was left of it? It had gone 200 feet and hit the rocks and come apart, and the horses were down there under the snow somewhere, and there was a wheel standing straight up in a drift like a monument somebody meant to finish later. Bram went along the shelf on his belly. He tied a rope to the axle and the other end around himself, and he was crawling, and the slope above us was making a sound, a low, settling sound, like something big turning over in its sleep. Ada was on the rope. I had it too. We had 11 feet of rope and 200 feet of mountain. He stopped. He was digging with his hands, with the ruined one and the good one both, throwing snow behind him like a dog, and he was making a noise I'd never heard a man make, a sort of grunting on every stroke, and then he stopped and put his face down into the hole he'd made. And he came up and turned around, and across 100 feet of blowing snow, he looked at Ada Rourke and he raised one hand, and he had 3 fingers up. 3 fingers. It meant nothing. It meant everything. It's how a man tells you a thing when he hasn't got breath to say it. The slope let go at 9 minutes past 7. Here is a thing nobody tells you about an avalanche. It doesn't roar. Not at the start. At the start it sighs, this long soft exhalation, like a barn settling, like a woman turning over in bed. And by the time it has anything to say for itself, you have already stopped being a man with a plan and become a man with a direction. Mine was sideways. I went sideways into the lee of a granite tooth about the size of a smokehouse, and I took Ada Rourke with me because she was on the rope, and I was on the rope, and the rope decided. The mountain went past. I don't have language for the next 20 seconds. I've tried. I tried to tell it to a doctor in Denver in 1908 who wanted to know why an old man wakes at 4 in the morning with his hands over his head. I said it was like standing behind a train. He wrote something down. It wasn't like standing behind a train. A train knows where it's going. This thing was searching. It came around both sides of that rock and reached in for us, and I felt it take my hat, and I felt it take the skin off the back of my right hand, and I felt the rope come tight across my chest hard enough that I heard something in me let go. And then, the way weather does, the way everything in this country does, it was simply over, and there was a silence so complete I thought I'd gone deaf. Snow sifting down out of the sky, fine as flour, sunlight coming through it, beautiful if you want to know. It was the most beautiful morning of my life, and I was screaming and couldn't hear myself. Ada was under me. I'd landed on her. Her mouth was moving. I got my ear down to her. "The rope," she was saying. "Amos, the rope." It ran off the rock and down into 15 feet of new debris, and it was singing. That's the only word. Pulled tight and thrumming, and every few seconds it jerked twice hard. Something on the other end of it was still pulling. We dug for 40 minutes with our hands and a wagon bow that Ada found in the slide, and it was not heroic, and there was a stretch in the middle of it where I sat back on my heels and said out loud, "He's dead, Ada." And she didn't answer me, and I have replayed that sentence more times than any other I have ever spoken. She got to him first. Of course she did. She was smaller, and she went down into the hole where a bigger person couldn't get, head first, up to her waist, and she came up with her arms around Col Bram's shoulders and her face gone the color of the snow, and she said one word. "Poe." He was folded around Elias Poe like a hand around a bird. That's what he'd done. He'd found the man under the shelf alive, alive on nothing but a rock overhang and a coat, and 11 hours of refusing, and he'd got him out, and the slope had come, and Col Bram had put his body between 200 feet of moving mountain and a stranger he had never spoken to. Elias Poe had a broken collarbone, 4 broken ribs, no shoes, and both eyes swollen shut from the light. He was conscious. He kept trying to tell us something about the horses. He was terribly, terribly worried about the horses. Bram's back was, I won't describe it. He'd taken it across the spine and the left shoulder, and the debris had put him into the rock. He was breathing in short sips, like a man tasting something too hot. When we got him up, his eyes went around and found Ada. He said 3. She said, "I saw." He said 3 fingers, like she hadn't understood, like it was very important. And then he passed out, and we got him onto Solomon and Elias Poe onto Solomon behind him. And I led that horse down the mountain with my ruined hand in my armpit, and Ada Rourke walking on the other side, holding 2 men on with nothing but her forearm across their legs. It took 4 hours to go 1.5 miles. The window was still yellow. I have to stop here for a second. I have to sit with that. Sarah Poe had been alone in that cabin for 6 hours with a boy and a stove, dying of cold, and she had crawled off that table on feet that were going to cost her 3 toes, and she had fed the fire. She'd burned the loom. Half of it. She'd got the beater and the shafts off it with a knife and a chair leg, and she'd burned Ada Rourke's loom to keep the room warm for people who might not come back. And when we came through that door, she was on the floor against the stove with her arms around Micah, and she looked up and saw her husband and made a sound I will not try to write. Ada looked at the loom. Then she looked at Sarah Poe and said, "Good, that's good. That's exactly right," and went and got the water on. Bram lasted 11 days. There, I've said it. I've told this story maybe 40 times in my life, and I have never once managed to say that part where it belongs, in the order it happened. I always hold it back. I always let people have another hour with him. He didn't die of the back. The back would have killed him, but it took its time about it. And what actually did it was the hand, the ruined one, the one he dug with, the one that had been frostbit and thawed and refrozen and torn open on rock. It went bad the way those things do. By the fourth day, the streaks were up past his elbow, and Ada was cutting into it twice a day with a knife she boiled, and he was letting her. And by the eighth day, he was mostly out of his head. He talked to his daughter. Her name was Cora. He talked to her the way you talk to a child in the next room while you were busy at something. Offhand. Comfortable, just a minute, Cora, let me finish this. And it was so ordinary and so terrible that Elias Poe, who was a hard man from Kentucky with a broken collarbone, got up on the ninth day and walked outside in the snow so as not to hear it. Micah wasn't afraid of him. That's a strange thing. The boy sat by him for hours. On the seventh day, Micah gave him the broken wooden horse, put it in the big man's good hand and closed the fingers around it, and Bram surfaced enough to look at it and say, "This here's a fine animal," and went back down. The horse went in the ground with him. Nobody discussed it. Ada just did it, and Micah watched, and afterward the boy went and sat in the woodshed for a long time. On the 10th day, he came up clear. It happens. Any doctor will tell you it means nothing, but I'll never believe that. He came up clear at about 4 in the afternoon, with the light coming through those 4 clean panes of glass, and he asked for water, and he drank it himself, and he looked around that 14 by 16 room like a man doing an inventory. Sarah Poe asleep on the cornchuck tick, feet wrapped. Elias by the stove with his arms strapped, whittling a leg for a horse. Micah on the floor with his head on the dog. There was a dog by then, some starved yellow thing that had come up out of the storm on the 6th day and been let in, because of course it had been let in, because that was the kind of place this was. Me in the corner, 9 days without shaving, 9 days without writing a word in my book. And Ada at the stove. Bram watched her a while, then he said, "Ma'am." She came over. "You know what you got here?" She said, "A mess." "No," he said. And he was quiet so long I thought he'd gone under again, and then he said, "I've been in the governor's house." I sat up. I'd been in the governor's house. It's a strange thing to have in common with a man dying on a table. "Freighted furs there in '84, he said. "Marble on the floor, room bigger'n a church, and a man in it with everything, and he rung a bell when he wanted somebody." Bram's mouth moved, something that had been a smile once. "I never met a man so poor in my life." He turned his head. It cost him something. 10 days, he said, in this box, and every one of you still here." He lifted his good hand about 2 inches off the blanket and let it fall. 14 foot, he said. It held 6. It held 6 and a dog and a man dying in it, and it never once got small. He was looking at the ceiling now. "That ain't the house, ma'am. Houses don't do that. That's you, and I ain't got the words, and I'm sorry for it, because somebody ought to have told you before now, and I don't reckon anybody has." Ada Rourke stood there with a dish rag in her hand. And she said quietly, awfully, "Everyone says it isn't enough." Bram closed his eyes. "Everyone," he said, "is standing outside." He died on the 11th night. Ada was awake. Nobody else was. She never told me what he said, if he said anything. I asked her once in 1893, when we were both too old to be delicate about things. She said he asked me to leave the door open. I said it was 10 below. She said I know it was. And she got up and went to see about the chickens. And that was the end of that conversation, and every other conversation about Cole Bram we ever had. The paper. You've been waiting. I've been dreading it. It was still in my coat. It had been in my coat through the storm and the slide and 11 days, and on the morning after we buried him in the corner of Ada's 40 acres, under the aspens, because the ground was frozen everywhere in Elias Poe, and I spent 2 days on that hole, and neither of us said one word about the fact that we were putting a man in ground I had come to take. On that morning, I got it out. Ada was at the woodpile. There was a woodpile by then. The Poes had been 3 weeks in a 14 by 16 room, and Elias Poe was a man who could not sit still, and the shed was full, and there was a linta going up, and the yellow dog had a name. She saw the paper. She knew what it was before I opened my mouth. I want to be honest, she knew. She'd known since January the 4th. She'd known when she said, "I've never known you to spend anything, Amos, that you didn't write down first." I said, "Ada." She said, "Don't be gentle about it. I've had 6 years of people being gentle about it." "So I wasn't," I said. "I bought your note off Doyle in October, $81. I came up here to take your spring. I've been carrying it since the 4th. The wind moved in the aspens over Bram. She said, and there it is. That's the whole of her right there in one word, and not how could you, not tears, just and. What now? What are you, Amos Kettle? Say it while I've got wood to split. I tore it up. I'd like to tell you it was a fine gesture. It wasn't. Tearing paper is nothing. Any fool can tear paper, and I stood there with the pieces going off across the snow, and I felt exactly as much of a fraud as I have ever felt in my life, because $81 was $81, and a torn note is still a debt, and the bank in Pueblo did not care what I had seen in a small room. So I did the other thing, the thing that cost. I said, "I'll give you the north pasture, 60 acres, deeded. For the spring rights, I'll pay for the water, $6 a year, and it's in writing and it's yours, and if I die my boy honors it or I'll come back and see about him." Ada Rourke put down the axe. She looked at me for a long, long time, and I have never in my life been so thoroughly looked at. Then she said, "No. I want to make sure you understand this because I didn't, and it took me 11 years. She said, "No." She said, "You'd be paying for coal, you'd be paying for the cradle, you'd sleep better, and I'd have 60 acres, and every time I looked at them I'd know what they were." She wiped her hands on her skirt. "I'm not a thing that gets settled, Amos. I've been a debt in your book for 6 years, and I won't be a credit in it now." I said, "Then what do you want?" And she said the thing that changed my life. She said it impatiently, like a woman with work to do. "Come to supper, you damned fool." I came to supper. I came to supper for 22 years. That's the whole ending. I know it isn't the one you're owed. There's no wedding, she never married me, and I never asked, and I don't believe either of us wanted it. We'd both been married once to people who were in the ground, and there was something in both of us that had gone quiet on that subject forever. There's no fortune. She was never rich. She died in 1911 owning 40 acres and a stove. But I sold the spring. Not to her. To me. I dug a line 6 miles at my own cost and paid her the $6 every spring on the same day, and I made her take it, and she'd fold the bill and put it in a coffee tin with a dent in it and never once say thank you, and that was the deal. That was the shape of it. And on the 4th of January, every year that I was alive and able, I rode up. Elias and Sarah Poe stayed in the valley. He built her a house with 8 rooms, and she hated it and spent most of her time in Ada's. Micah Poe went to school in Pueblo and then to school in Boston and came back a doctor. And when he set up, he wouldn't take money from anybody in the valley the first year. And Fen Doyle told him that was no way to run a business. And Micah Poe, 24 years old, in a coat that fit him, looked at Doyle and said, "Sir, I don't believe you've ever been snowed in." I wrote that one down. Ada's hand never came right. The web of it where the axe glanced. She couldn't spread the fingers past a certain point, and it ached when the weather turned, and I'd see her rubbing it at the table sometimes, absently, the way you'd rub a stone in your pocket. She never built another loom. I offered. She said she was done making things that took that long. But here's what she did do, and I only found it out in 1904, when I went up in October and she was in the barn, and I let myself in to leave the money. Under the window, where the cradle had been. A shelf, And on the shelf in a row in a 14 by 16 room, the four legs of a broken wooden horse, whittled by a man with a strapped collarbone, a tin of coffee with a dent in it, a dog's collar, no dog, a strip of harness leather, cut clean through, and a piece of black walnut about the size of my palm, with 2 inches of a running vine on it, that she must have picked up off her own floor at 2 in the morning on the 4th of January, while the rest of us were looking at the fire. She'd been keeping accounts. Her whole life she'd been keeping accounts, the same as me, and I'd never seen it because hers had no columns and no money in them, and nothing was ever marked paid. I burned my book, the oilcloth one, and the 11 that came before it. 39 years of owed and paid. I did it in Ada's stove in the winter of 1905, and she watched me do it and said nothing. And afterward she poured coffee out of a dented tin and set it in front of me, and we sat there a while. Then she said, "Holly's Meeks." I said, "Salado River, 1877. She said, "Well then, you do remember it." And I understood that I had never needed to write anything down. Not once. That I had been a frightened boy of 19 who could not trust his own heart to hold what mattered, and so had built a machine to hold it for him, and the machine had made me a man who could ride out with a legal instrument in his coat and call it weather. Bram had it right. It was never the house. It was never the house, and it was never the book, and the poorest man I ever met had marble on his floor and a bell he could ring, and the richest was 5'2" with ash in her hair, on her knees, at 2 in the morning, swinging an axe 11 times at the last beautiful thing she owned so a stranger could stop shaking. She's been gone 15 years. The cabin's still standing. It's mine now, she left it to me, which was the only unkind thing she ever did, because a man of 86 has no business with a 14 by 16 room he can't stop going back to. The window has 4 panes of real glass. 3 of them are original. I go up in January. My grandson takes me now. I can't sit a horse. He asked me last year why I don't have the place fixed up, and I couldn't answer him, and he's a good boy so he let it alone, and we stood there in the snow with the aspens going over Bram. I'll tell you what I didn't tell him. Sometimes when the light's right and it's late and the wind is working in that stovepipe that still leans south, I can smell it. Walnut burning, that church smell. And I'm 61 years old again, and standing in a doorway with a paper in my coat, and there's a woman on her knees in front of me who is about to do the bravest thing I will ever witness, and I have not yet said the words I rehearsed, and I still, even now, God help me, even now, at the end of a long life in which I have been forgiven far more than I deserved, I still don't move.